Welcome to Chapter and Verse, the show where we take a deep dive into compelling sources to extract the most important insights, giving you a valuable shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, our source material is a truly foundational and often provocative book, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Our mission with this deep dive isn't really to endorse any single historical viewpoint, but to help you understand the core arguments and the, well, compelling evidence Zinn presents. This allows you, our listener, to critically engage with this alternative lens on America's past.
Exactly. And Zinn's approach is, I think, best described as a fundamental perspective shift. It's quite radical in that way. Instead of history told through the lens of, political leaders or economic elites, he chronicles the past from the viewpoint of marginalized and oppressed groups. We're talking Native Americans, African Americans, women, workers, the people often left out of the traditional story. What's particularly compelling, I find, is how he emphasizes themes of resistance and struggle. He's constantly revealing how ordinary people pushed back against power, often in really ingenious ways. Ultimately, his work serves as a powerful critique of those traditional narrative, exposing systems of power, inequality, and injustice that are often, let's say, glossed over in other accounts. It really compels us, you included, to question these deeply held assumptions we might have about progress and what truly constitutes, quote-unquote, national interest.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Zinn starts right at the beginning, challenging a figure we often learn about through a very heroic lens, Christopher Columbus. We're taught about discovery, this idea of a new world opening up. But Zinn immediately challenges that conventional heroism. He introduces us instead to the Arawaks of the Bahama Islands. And he highlights how European observers, even the Spanish themselves, describe them as remarkably hospitable, with a deep belief in sharing.
Right, which was such a stark contrast to the Europe of the Renaissance. Zinn notes it was dominated by this frenzy for money.
Exactly. And that contrast right there at the point of contact sets up this profound initial perspective shift that he carries throughout the book.
It really does. And Columbus's own words, which Zinn meticulously quotes, they reveal his immediate intentions upon arrival. It's quite chilling, actually. He explicitly stated, and this is a direct quote, "I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts."
So right from the outset, force and coercion were part of the plan. Not exactly a friendly exchange.
Not at all. And this wasn't an isolated incident. It quickly escalated. As the frantic search for gold intensified, and frankly the supply dwindled pretty fast, the Arawaks were subjected to forced labor on these vast agricultural and mining estates. It was part of a brutal system called encomiendas.
Encomiendas that essentially granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labor and land, right?
Precisely. And they were worked at a ferocious, completely unsustainable pace. It led to their deaths by the thousands. The numbers Zinn presents are just horrifying. By 1515, maybe only 50,000 remained, down from hundreds of thousands. By 1550, that number had plummeted to a mere 500.
500. From hundreds of thousands in just a few decades.
And tragically, a report from 1650 confirms that none of the original Arawaks or their descendants were left on the island. Just gone.
That's a devastating trajectory. And what's really crucial to understand about this account, as you mentioned Zinn's use of sources, is that he relies heavily on the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas. And here's where it gets particularly insightful. Las Casas wasn't some detached observer, was he?
No, not at all. He was a young priest who initially participated in the conquest of Cuba. He even owned Indian slaves himself. But then he underwent this profound change of heart, gave up his plantation, and dedicated his life to meticulously documenting the atrocities he witnessed. He described the mild and pacific temperament of the natives against the Spanish work of exasperating, ravaging, killing, mangling, and destroying. It's brutal language.
And he blamed Columbus directly.
He did. Las Casas noted Columbus's irreparable crimes were driven by what he saw as an insatiable desire to please the king, to bring back riches. This personal journey, from participant to fervent critic, gives his account immense moral weight. It's a powerful eyewitness critique of the whole enterprise.
So this raises the really important question that Zinn forces us to consider. Why isn't this the dominant narrative we usually encounter in our history books? Why the focus on heroism?
Exactly. Zinn argues that emphasizing Columbus's heroism while sort of minimizing or de-emphasizing the genocide, isn't a neutral act. It's not a technical necessity, as he puts it. He calls it an ideological choice. He's not saying we should, accuse, judge, condemn Columbus in absentia. He thinks that's a useless scholarly exercise. Rather, he urges us, you the listener included, to recognize how the easy acceptance of atrocities as a deplorable but necessary price to pay for progress continues to shape our present understanding.
So it's about how we remember the past affects the present.
Precisely. How accepting past atrocities makes us numb to injustice today. Zinn's profound insight here is that sanitizing history, glossing over the ugly parts for a comfortable narrative of progress, isn't just a historical mistake. It's an active choice that shapes how we view our present. He asks us, what inconvenient truths are we burying right now as radioactive wastes are buried in containers, to use his powerful metaphor?
That's a really powerful challenge. So, okay, if the Spanish story Zinn presents is one of brutal subjugation, what about the English colonization? Often, traditional narratives might paint them a bit differently, maybe focusing more on, religious freedom or building a new society.
Well, Zinn argues that in many ways we see a chillingly similar pattern, brutal subjugation again. Leading the English, when they found they couldn't effectively enslave Native Americans or live peacefully alongside them, they decided on a systematic policy of extermination. That's the word Zinn uses, drawing from historical accounts. This wasn't just random violence, it was a calculated approach.
A calculated approach. How so?
The historian Edmund Morgan describes their method, and it's just bone-chilling. They would feign peaceful intentions, allow indigenous communities to settle, plant their corn, and then, just before harvest, fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn, destroying their food source, ensuring starvation and displacement.
That's horrific. A deliberate strategy of annihilation.
Absolutely. And it was explicitly exemplified after a devastating attack by indigenous groups in Virginia. The English response wasn't just defense. They avenged the deaths of that day many times over, perpetuating this horrific cycle of violence and land seizure.
And the deception involved?
Yeah.
The sheer duplicity faced by Native Americans is just heartbreakingly clear in some accounts Zinn uses. Like during an expedition to Block Island and Pequot villages, English officers actually recorded the Pequots calling out, "What cheer, Englishmen? What cheer? What do you come for?"
Yeah, you can almost hear the openness, maybe even confusion in that greeting. A stark contrast to the colonizers' intentions, which were clearly hostile from the start. It really underscores a profound moment of betrayal.
Thinking about this within the broader context of Zinn's work, how does he explain this level of brutality? Is it just individual cruelty?
He attributes it not merely to individual malice, though that was certainly present, but to something deeper, something systemic. He points to a special powerful drive born in civilizations based on private property. He quotes Roger Williams, a contemporary critic, who called it a depraved appetite after the great vanities, dreams, and shadows of this vanishing life, great portions of land.
So the economic system itself fueled the violence.
That's Zinn's core argument here, how economic systems, the relentless pursuit of wealth and private land, especially in conditions of perceived scarcity and competition, tragically transformed a basic human need for resources into, as Zinn puts it, the murder of whole peoples. It completely reframes the colonization narrative, shifting the focus from heroic pioneers to the destructive consequences of a specific economic and social structure.
And before European arrival, these Native American societies were far from the primitive image often portrayed, right? Zinn makes a point of detailing their complexity.
Absolutely. He meticulously documents them as thriving and incredibly complex. You find these fascinating details about the mound builders in the Ohio River Valley, for instance. They constructed enormous earth sculptures. Some were truly massive, like one Zinn describes that was 3.5 miles long, enclosing 100 acres, shaped into huge humans, birds, or serpents. Just incredible feats of engineering and artistry.
And these weren't just isolated wonders.
Not at all. They were part of a vast trading network that stretched from the Great Lakes all the way to the far west and down to the Gulf of Mexico. This demonstrates sophisticated organization, interconnectedness, long before European contact. It shatters that myth of isolated, unchanging societies.
And what about their social structures? Zinn often uses indigenous societies as a kind of counter-narrative.
Exactly. One striking point he makes is about the Iroquois Confederacy. Their social structure offers a powerful contrast to European concepts of property and gender. They practice communal land ownership, common work. Hunting catches were shared. Houses were often occupied by several families together. The whole idea of private ownership of land was, as Zinn quotes sources saying, foreign to them.
So completely different values around property and community.
Completely. A French Jesuit priest living among them in the 1650s noted their remarkable social harmony. He wrote, "No poor houses are needed among them because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except in common."
Wow. That directly contrasts with that frenzy for money Zinn mentioned earlier about Renaissance Europe.
It does. It highlights a stark philosophical difference rooted in community and sharing, not accumulation.
And Zinn notes this difference extended to gender roles too, didn't it? Particularly with the Iroquois.
Yes, very significantly. He draws on historian Gary B. Nash's work, which points out that in Iroquois society, power was shared between the sexes. Women played crucial roles tending crops, managing village affairs, and crucially, they even had some control over military matters because they supplied essential provisions like moccasins and food for warring expeditions. If they disapproved of a war, they could withhold these supplies.
So real influence, not just domestic roles.
Real influence. Nash states, "The European idea of male dominancy and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent. This really challenges our assumptions about traditional gender roles and offers another perspective on indigenous societies that mainstream history often just ignores and simplifies."
And even child rearing reflected these different values.
It did. Children in Iroquois society were raised with a philosophy vastly different from European norms at the time. They were taught independence, equality, not submission. Sources Zinn uses suggest they weren't subjected to harsh punishment or forced early weaning. The focus seems to have been entirely on fostering self-reliance and solidarity, community responsibility.
A completely different approach. This deep dive into early America also has to confront the brutal establishment of the transatlantic slave trade, a foundational injustice that Zinn obviously doesn't shy away from.
No, he confronts it head on. And he makes a really critical distinction right at the start. He points out that African forms of servitude, which existed before European involvement, were fundamentally different. In many African societies, slaves, as they were called, often had rights. They could marry, own property, sometimes even inherit from their masters. It wasn't the chattel slavery that developed in the Americas.
So it wasn't the same dehumanizing system.
Not at all. Zinn argues that the European demand for labor fundamentally transformed and intensified slavery, making it exponentially more brutal. They created, in his words, the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantations, an unprecedented system of dehumanization driven by profit.
And the journey itself, the Middle Passage, Zinn details the absolute horror of it.
Unimaginable horror. He cites figures suggesting 1 of every 3 blacks transported overseas died during the voyage. Descriptions from the time are sickening decks so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. People were packed so tightly they could barely breathe. Despair was so profound that many enslaved people jumped overboard to drown rather than continue the suffering.
Just horrific.
And all driven by
Profit, huge profits, often double the investment on a single trip. This, Zinn starkly puts it, made the trade worthwhile for the slave trader despite the staggering human cost. It's a recurring theme. Economic incentives fueling unimaginable human suffering. It's no surprise, then, that individuals enduring such an ordeal arrived, as Zinn says, in a state of psychic and physical helplessness, making them ripe for enslavement.
Right. And Zinn notes that the colonists found it impossible to effectively use indigenous peoples for large-scale plantation labor. They died too quickly from disease or resisted too effectively. And white indentured servants were problematic too. They had rights, contracts expired, they could run away and blend in.
So the demand fell on Africans.
Increasingly and insatiably, yes. Black enslaved people became the primary source of forced labor, particularly in the southern colonies. It was a calculated economic decision based on who was most vulnerable and controllable for maximum profit.
But even under these unimaginable conditions, Zinn emphasizes resistance. It wasn't passive acceptance.
Never passive acceptance. From the very beginning, resistance emerged, showing that enduring human impulse to assert one's humanity even in the smallest ways. A Virginia statute from 1669 already referred to the obstinacy of many of them, indicating a persistent spirit of defiance. By 1680, the Virginia Assembly was worried about slave meetings under the pretense of feasts and brawls, seeing them as having dangerous consequence. They feared organized rebellion.
So even gathering was seen as dangerous.
Absolutely. And Gerald Mullen's study of 18th century Virginia records, which Zinn draws on, reveals the sheer breadth of what planters considered rebellious slaves. It wasn't just uprisings, it was being lazy, thieving, feigning illness, destroying crops and tools, running away, operating black markets. And yes, sometimes it escalated to being killers, arsonists, and insurrectionists. Resistance was a daily, pervasive fact of enslaved life.
And this constant resistance must have created intense fear among the white ruling class.
Constant tension and fear. Zinn gives examples. In 1720, a wicked and barbarous plot of the design of the Negroes' Rising was supposedly discovered in South Carolina. The reaction was brutal. Hangings, burnings, banishment. Similar suspected plots or even just suspicious fires in places like Boston and New Haven led to executions and severe new rules laws forbidding 2 or more enslaved people from gathering without white supervision. It highlights the constant anxiety simmering just beneath the surface.
And Zinn also points out alliances, right, between enslaved people and indigenous groups.
Yes, striking instances of enslaved people running away to indigenous villages. Groups like the Creeks and Cherokees harbored hundreds, and many runaways eventually amalgamated into the Indian tribes, forming these alliances of the oppressed.
Which must have terrified the ruling class even more.
Exactly. And this highlights a crucial strategy they employed to maintain control. They used not only harsh slave codes to suppress black resistance directly, but also offered bribes to the Indians to help put down black rebels.
Playing groups off against each other.
Precisely. Dividing potential allies, preventing a united front of those being exploited, reinforcing their power. It shows the calculated methods used to maintain the system of oppression.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. As we move into the colonial period leading up to the Revolution, the traditional narrative often emphasizes this shared pursuit of freedom, right? Liberty for all.
That's the common story. But Zinn immediately complicates it by uncovering what he calls a significant hidden history. He points out that more than half the colonists who came to the North American shores came as servants. These weren't free settlers seeking liberty. They were bound by indentures, often living in conditions not far removed from slavery itself.
So a profound class division existed right from the start, even among the European colonists.
A huge class division. Abbott Smith's study of colonial society, which Zinn cites, reveals a stark reality. Smith concluded colonial society was not democratic and certainly not equalitarian. It was dominated by men who had money enough to make others work for them.
And upward mobility wasn't common for these servants, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea.
Smith found that few of these men, the elites, were descended from indentured servants, and practically none had themselves been of that class. It directly challenges that myth of widespread opportunity for all white colonists, reinforcing Zinn's focus on deep-seated class struggle and entrenched privilege right from the beginning.
And this wasn't accidental. It was by design, according to some of the leaders themselves.
Yes. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, explicitly stated the ruling philosophy back in 1630. He laid bare the hierarchical intentions. He wrote quite clearly, "In all times, some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection." They saw this inequality not as a problem to be fixed, but as a divinely ordained social order.
Wow. And this ideal of order contrasted sharply with the reality on the ground, particularly in the cities.
Increasingly so. Zinn highlights the growing poverty in places like Boston, which directly contradicted the image of colonial prosperity. Over about 80 years, from 1687 to 1770, the percentage of adult men who owned no property and therefore couldn't vote nearly doubled, from 14% to 29%. A huge jump.
And losing property meant losing political voice.
Exactly. It created this growing, disenfranchised segment of the population struggling just to survive. Poorhouses were overflowing with the unemployed, with war veterans discarded after conflicts, with new immigrants arriving with nothing. A deep economic crisis was simmering beneath the surface.
And this poverty, Zinn argues, fueled anger, real discontent.
Significant anger and discontent. It's a crucial element of the pre-revolutionary unrest that often gets overlooked when we just focus on taxes. An anonymous pamphleteer in Massachusetts, writing after one of the colonial wars, vividly described it. "Poverty and discontent appear in every face except the countenances of the rich, and dwell upon every tongue."
Blaming the rich directly.
Explicitly, he condemned the birds of prey, enemies to all communities, who had profited immensely from these wars, accumulating fortunes while the majority suffered. This bred deep resentment against the emerging colonial elite.
So before the revolution against Britain, There was already intense class anger within the colonies.
Absolutely. Cities like Boston were simmering with it,
Mm-hmm.
and it often boiled over into direct action. We see this clearly in the response to the Stamp Act of 1765. A shoemaker, Ebenezer McIntosh, led a mob Zinn calls them the lower orders in destroying the house of Andrew Oliver, a rich Boston merchant who was supposed to enforce the act. They weren't just protesting the tax, they were targeting a symbol of wealth and power.
And it didn't stop there.
No. 2 weeks later, the crowd's anger was still focused on the elite. They turned on Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, another key symbol of the rich ruling class. They smashed his house with axes, drank his wine, looted his furniture, scattered his papers. A report sent back to England described this as part of a larger scheme for a war of plunder, of general leveling and taking away the distinction of rich and poor.
A war of plunder that suggests a real class-based radicalism, not just anti-British feeling.
It really does. A yearning for fundamental economic change bubbling up from below.
And it wasn't just rioting. There were specific political demands coming for these groups, too.
Yes, incredibly illuminating demands from the mechanics, the artisans, laborers in colonial cities. Their demands went way beyond just opposing British taxes. They called for genuine democratic participation. They wanted open meetings of representative assemblies, public galleries, and legislative halls so people could watch. The publishing of roll call votes so constituents could hold representatives accountable.
Real transparency.
Exactly, and more. Open-air policy meetings for direct public input, equitable taxes, price controls on essentials, and critically, the election of ordinary people mechanics themselves to government posts.
These weren't just protests. They sound like demands for a fundamental shift in who held political power.
Precisely. It highlights this grassroots resistance that aimed to redistribute influence, not just switch masters from London to local elites.
And in some places, they actually gained significant power. Zinn mentions Philadelphia.
Yes, Philadelphia by mid-1776 saw a remarkable surge of popular power. Historian Gary Nash, cited by Zinn, argues that laborers, artisans, and small tradesmen employing extra-legal measures when electoral politics failed were in clear command. They, along with some middle-class leaders like Thomas Paine, launched a full-scale attack on wealth and even on the right to acquire unlimited private property.
An attack on unlimited private property? That's radical.
Extremely radical for the time. It shows the revolutionary fervor wasn't solely about independence from Britain. It was also deeply concerned with internal social and economic justice, challenging the very foundations of the existing economic hierarchy.
And this kind of unrest wasn't limited to the cities.
No, Zinn points to widespread tenant riots, farmers rising up against landlords in places like New Jersey in the 1740s, New York in the 1750s and 60s, and also the rebellion in the Green Mountains that eventually created Vermont. These weren't just sporadic disturbances. He describes them as long-lasting social movements, highly organized, involving the creation of counter-governments. They were directly aimed at a handful of rich landlords, demonstrating persistent, organized resistance against economic exploitation long before 1776.
So even events we think we know well, like the Boston Massacre, Zinn argues had this class dimension.
He does. It's often portrayed primarily as a clash between colonists and British soldiers over abstract rights or taxes, but Zinn points out the backdrop. There had been impressment riots throughout the 1760s in various port cities, where hundreds of seamen, boys, even enslaved black individuals rioted against the British Navy forcing them into service, and also against British soldiers taking scarce jobs on the docks.
So fundamental economic grievances were already fueling conflict with the British military.
Exactly. The tension wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was fundamentally about livelihoods, jobs, economic survival, essentially, class struggle.
Even the Boston Tea Party. Zinn notes something interesting there, too.
Yeah, while it was organized by the elite-led Boston Committee of Correspondence, they still felt the need to issue warnings against destroying any other private property besides the tea. This indicates their attempt to manage and contain the more radical, potentially class-based anger within the crowd to keep the focus narrowly on the tea tax.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move into the revolution itself and its aftermath. The Declaration of Independence famously proclaims, "All men are created equal." A powerful, resonant phrase.
Hugely powerful and inspirational, continues to be. But Zinn immediately asks us to look closer at the context and limitations of that language in 1776. He argues it was almost certainly not a deliberate, inclusive statement about women who were, for all practical political purposes, invisible and beyond consideration for civic equality at the time.
And certainly not including everyone else either.
Definitely not. Critically, it didn't extend to enslaved African Americans who were considered property or to Native Americans who were viewed as obstacles or enemies. So if we connect this to Zinn's bigger picture, he argues the Declaration primarily functioned to mobilize certain groups of Americans, ignoring others.
Using inspirational language to unify some people while excluding others.
Precisely. Its powerful words, Zinn suggests, often serve to cover up serious conflicts of interest within colonial society and mask the omission of large parts of the human race. It highlights the selective nature of the freedom being declared. It really forces you to ask, equal for whom?
And who actually led this revolution? We're often taught it was a broad uprising, a truly democratic movement.
Zinn challenges that directly, drawing on historians like Carl Degler, who stated quite bluntly, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class.
The existing elites.
Exactly. George Washington was arguably the richest man in America. John Hancock, a hugely prosperous Boston merchant. Benjamin Franklin, a wealthy printer and businessman. These weren't the disenfranchised poor leading a charge to overturn the social order.
So if the war didn't bring a new class to power, what did it accomplish for the ordinary person, according to Zinn's perspective?
Well, he acknowledges that the rhetoric of liberty and the shared experience of military service did draw in town mechanics, laborers, and seamen, as well as small farmers. It helped forge a sense of the people, creating a kind of national consensus. But, and this is Zinn's crucial point, this consensus was inherently built upon the exclusion of ignored and oppressed people, women, Black people, Native Americans, even many poor whites.
So the unity was conditional and incomplete.
Very much so. The revolution, while celebrated, didn't fundamentally alter the internal power structure or address the grievances of all these groups. Zinn frames it as a revolution for certain people, primarily property-owning white men, not all people. It's a critical distinction in his analysis.
And Zinn also points out how British policy towards Native Americans actually fueled the revolutionary cause for some colonists.
Yes, it's an interesting dynamic. The British, trying to manage their expanded empire after the French and Indian War, issued the Proclamation of 1763. This declared lands west of the Appalachians out of bounds to whites, essentially protecting Native American territory from immediate colonial encroachment.
Which angered colonists eager to expand westward.
Deeply angered them. Land speculators, settlers, farmers, they saw their westward expansion curtailed. Zinn argues this helps explain why most of the Indians fought for England during the Revolution. The British, however self-interestedly, appeared to offer a better chance of preserving their lands than the land-hungry colonists.
And within the American military itself, Zinn highlights significant internal dissent. It wasn't all patriotic unity.
Not at all. He emphasizes the mutinies, like the one involving the Pennsylvania line and later the New Jersey line. These weren't small grumbles. They were large-scale actions by soldiers demonstrating deep grievances about lack of pay, poor conditions, and broken promises.
How did the leadership react to that?
Washington's response was brutally swift and harsh. In the case of the New Jersey Mutiny, he ordered surrounding mutineers with loyal troops. 2 ringleaders were selected and executed by firing squads made up of their own friends who, Zinn quotes sources saying, wept as they pulled the triggers.
Executed by their friends. That's horrific.
Washington himself said it was necessary to set an example. This reveals the harsh realities and the class tensions simmering even within the Continental Army. It underscores that the fight for freedom wasn't monolithic and had its own internal contradictions and repressions.
Okay, so the war is won. Now we get to the Constitution, often presented as this almost sacred document for all Americans, the bedrock of liberty.
Right. The traditional narrative presents it as a wise, almost inevitable culmination of the revolution, designed for universal benefit. But Zinn, drawing on figures like James Madison himself, offers a very different interpretation. He points to Madison's arguments in Federalist #10, where Madison clearly reveals whose peace he's most concerned with keeping. Madison warns against a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project.
Improper or wicked project. like redistributing wealth or easing debt for the poor.
Exactly. Zinn argues this phrasing strongly implies the Constitution's intent was, in large part, to protect the interests of property owners, the wealthy elite, from the potential pressures of a more democratic majority. It sets up a clear hierarchy of concerns right in the nation's founding. Protect property first.
So Zinn sees the Constitution less as a document for liberty and more as one for maintaining privilege.
That's the core of his argument. He suggests the Constitution wasn't simply about establishing a decent and orderly society, but was fundamentally the work of certain groups trying to maintain their privileges, while cleverly offering just enough rights and liberties to enough of the people to ensure popular support.
A strategic compromise to maintain control.
A strategic compromise, particularly, Zinn emphasizes, between the slaveholding interests of the South and moneyed interests of the North. This compromise famously allowed the horrific transatlantic slave trade to continue for another 20 years, enshrined right there in the framework of government.
That really highlights how the structure was designed to protect specific economic interests from the start.
It does. Zinn frequently invokes the historian Charles Beard, who warned that governments are never truly neutral. They inevitably represent the dominant economic interests.
And while many Americans owned some property back then, the distribution was vastly unequal.
Extremely unequal. Zinn cites historian Jackson Turner Main's research, which found that while maybe half the white male population owned some land, only 3% of the population had truly large holdings and could be considered wealthy.
So when the Constitution protected property, it was primarily safeguarding the immense wealth of a tiny elite, not the modest holdings of the average person.
That's the implication. And what's particularly revealing, Zinn argues, is Alexander Hamilton's philosophy, which was immediately put into practice during Washington's first administration. Hamilton openly believed that government must ally itself with the richest elements of society to make itself strong. This wasn't some hidden agenda, it was explicit policy.
And how did that translate into actual policies?
It led directly to things like the creation of the Bank of the United States, essentially a partnership between the government and private banking interests. It led to tariffs that benefited manufacturers, often at the expense of consumers or farmers. Zinn gives the later example of J.P. Morgan's firm profiting immensely from government bond issues that the government could have sold directly to the public, but chose to run through private bankers for hefty commissions. It shows the deep intertwining of government and elite financial interests right from the beginning.
So the mythology around the Founding Fathers often ignores this economic reality.
Zinn, echoing historians like Bernard Bailyn, argues that the mythology often obscures this underlying reality of consolidating and maintaining power and privilege. Zinn's goal is to bring that economic dimension, that class struggle, back to the forefront of how we understand the nation's founding.
Okay, let's move into some of the persistent struggles Zinn details after the founding period. He dedicates significant attention to women, whom he calls the intimately oppressed. Why that term?
It reflects the way women's oppression operated within the most personal spaces, the home, the family, often enforced not just by law, but by culture, religion, and personal relationships, by husbands, fathers, ministers. It was pervasive and deeply embedded.
And colonial law reflected this deeply.
Absolutely. Zinn highlights examples like the crime of having a child out of wedlock. Women faced public punishment, heavy fines, social ruin. Meanwhile, the father often remained untouched by the law and on the loose. He uses Benjamin Franklin's satirical invention, the speech of Miss Polly Baker, to vividly illustrate this injustice. Polly is supposedly prosecuted 5 times for having children outside marriage, despite raising them herself, while the men involved, including magistrates, face no consequences.
It's a powerful illustration of the double standard and the legal system reinforcing women's vulnerability.
Definitely. And Puritan New England, Zinn notes, really epitomized this subjection. Reverend John Cotton, a hugely influential church father, unequivocally declared that the idea the husband should obey his wife is a false principle, for God hath put another law upon women. Wives, be subject to your husbands in all things.
So religious doctrine was used to enforce subordination.
Explicitly. And this ideology was reinforced by popular conduct books like Advice to a Daughter, which were widely read and instructed women on piety, purity, domesticity, and crucially, submission. It created this pervasive cultural and religious framework for keeping women in their place.
But despite this powerful education of subordination, Zinn highlights women who rebelled.
Always. Resistance is a constant theme. Anne Hutchinson is a prime example from the early Massachusetts Bay Colony. a religious woman, mother of 13, but she defied the powerful church fathers. She insisted on her right and the right of other ordinary people to interpret the Bible for themselves, challenging the minister's authority. She drew large crowds, mostly women, to her meetings.
And the authorities didn't tolerate that.
Not at all. They saw her as a threat to their power and the social order. She was interrogated, put on trial, and ultimately banished from the colony for her defiance. It was an incredible act of individual and intellectual resistance against entrenched religious and political authority.
How did women find spaces or opportunities for influence even within these constraints?
Well, Zinn points out that practicality sometimes created openings. In pre-industrial America, before factory production took over many household tasks, women held economically vital roles. They were printers, managed businesses like tanneries, kept taverns, and especially they were midwives, holding crucial medical knowledge and community standing. He mentions Martha Moore Ballard, a midwife in Maine around 1795, who delivered over 1,000 babies in her career.
So A had skills and economic roles. But Zinn suggests this changed with industrialization.
Yes, he argues a subtle but significant shift occurred as the factory system grew and work moved outside the home. Aggressiveness, competition, became more defined as male traits. Women were increasingly told their sphere was the home, that they should be passive, dependent. Even women's clothing styles, Zinn notes, like tight corsets and voluminous petticoats, reflected this deliberate separation from the world of activity, symbolizing their enforced confinement and reinforcing perceived physical weakness.
And this led to the rise of the cult of true womanhood.
Exactly. Emerging strongly after 1820, this was a powerful cultural construct pushed through magazines, sermons, books. It emphasized 4 cardinal virtues for women: piety, purity, domesticity, and submission. Religion was often used to reinforce dependence on men.
But even this didn't stop women from fighting back, particularly working women.
Absolutely not. Zinn highlights some of the earliest industrial strikes in the U.S. back in the 1830s involved women textile workers in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. These women earned incredibly low wages, maybe less than 37.5 cents for grueling 12 to 16-hour days in the mills. When wages were cut or conditions worsened, they organized.
Like the strike in Lowell in 1834.
Precisely. When a young woman was fired for organizing, others walked out in solidarity. One famously climbed a town pump and gave, as the record described it, a flaming Mary Wollstonecraft speech on the rights of women. It apparently had a powerful effect, showing this spontaneous, articulate rebellion.
And these actions continued despite likely repercussions.
Yes, resistance persisted, even after initial defeats. Zinn cites historian Herbert Gutman's findings from one mill's records, where 28 women were discharged for things like misconduct, disobedience, impudence, levity, and even mutiny.
Mutiny. Just for challenging the bosses.
Exactly. These seemingly minor acts documented by the company itself were clear signs of constant tension, a refusal to passively accept brutal conditions.
And women challenged the ideology too, not just the economic conditions.
Yes. When the General Association of Ministers of Massachusetts tried to silence women by commanding ministers to forbid them from speaking from pulpits, Sarah Grimke, a prominent abolitionist and women's rights advocate, responded forcefully. She wrote her powerful Letters on the Condition of Women and the Equality of the Sexes, directly challenging the system head-on and articulating women's rights. It's a powerful illustration of persistent struggle against entrenched patriarchy on both economic and ideological fronts.
Let's turn back to the experience of Native Americans after the initial colonization. Zinn portrays the policy of forced removal as relentless,
Right.
challenging any narrative of peaceful assimilation.
Absolutely relentless. Despite prominent figures like Lewis Cass, who became Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War, foreseeing their eventual extinction as almost inevitable, indigenous groups deeply resisted leaving their ancestral lands. They demonstrated this enduring connection to their heritage, a powerful refusal to surrender their identity and be forcibly displaced.
And Zinn uses their own words to show why they resisted so strongly.
Yes, and it's incredibly poignant. The reasons go far beyond just land ownership in the European sense. He quotes a council of Creeks refusing money for land because it was the place in which our fathers and friends are buried. An old Choctaw chief told President Monroe, "We wish to remain here, where we have grown up as the herbs of the woods, and do not wish to be transplanted into another soil."
Such powerful imagery.
Isn't it? And a Seminole chief spoke of an even deeper, almost physical connection. Here, our navel strings were first cut, and the blood from them sunk into the earth and made the country dear to us. This reveals the profound spiritual, ancestral, and deeply personal ties that made removal an unbearable prospect. It's a powerful counter-narrative to the government's justifications based on progress or empty land.
And the removals themselves, when they happened, were brutal. Zinn describes the Choctaw journey.
A complete nightmare. Their long journey west in late 1831 was marked by chaos, disorganization, hunger, disease like cholera. And Zinn emphasizes, private contractors profited ruthlessly from their suffering, providing inadequate food and supplies.
Profiting from removal.
Yes. One observer described the scene. Marshaled by guards, hustled by agents, harried by contractors, they were being herded on the way to an unknown and unwelcome destination like a flock of sick sheep. It's a tragic testament to the dehumanizing process of forced removal, a deliberate act cloaked in legalistic terms, but amounting to ethnic cleansing.
And states like Georgia were particularly aggressive in pushing removal.
Extremely aggressive. Georgia passed laws essentially nullifying Cherokee sovereignty, making it a crime for whites sympathetic to the Cherokees to even live in their territory without taking an oath of allegiance to Georgia. Missionaries like Samuel Worcester and Eliza Butler, who refused to take the oath as it would grant legitimacy to Georgia's repressive laws, were arrested, chained, forced to walk miles, beaten, and jailed. It highlights the state's ruthless determination to seize Cherokee land.
And resistance continued, even in the face of such overwhelming force. Zinn tells the story of Osceola.
Yes, Osceola, a young Seminole chief. His wife was captured and enslaved because she had some African ancestry, under laws targeting black people. Osceola himself was later imprisoned and chained by the Indian agent Wiley Thompson. But Osceola escaped or was released and became a fierce leader of Seminole guerrilla resistance in the Florida swamps. In a swift act of retribution, he later ambushed and shot down Thompson, the agent who had chained him.
Wow. A direct act of defiance.
A powerful act of personal and communal defiance against overwhelming injustice. It's a core theme. Zinn spotlights active, often desperate resistance, not passive victimhood.
Okay, let's return to the institution of slavery. Zinn uses statistics, but also emphasizes the human cost in ways numbers can't capture.
Exactly. The statistics are staggering enough. He cites plantation records showing a devastating death rate. On one Louisiana plantation between 1850 and 1855, out of 32 deaths recorded, only 4 people reached age 60. 9 died before age 5. It underscores the brutal, life-shortening reality of the system.
But statistics don't show the daily terror, the emotional toll.
No. Zinn stresses that families were constantly torn apart by sales. He includes Abram Scriven's heart-wrenching letter to his wife, written as he was about to be sold away, saying goodbye, "If we shall not meet in this world, I hope to meet in heaven." It's just gut-wrenching.
The violence. Whippings were constant.
A constant presence used routinely as work discipline. But Zinn also uses historian Herbert Gutman's research to challenge the stereotype of the docile or devoted slave. Gutman's analysis of plantation records found that 4 in 5 cotton pickers engaged in one or more disorderly acts, things like working slowly, feigning illness, breaking tools. And interestingly, he found a slightly higher percentage of women than men resisted in these ways.
So, widespread, daily resistance, not just big revolts.
Pervasive, subtle, constant pushback against the brutal conditions, rather than passive acceptance.
Zinn also highlights moments where the ruling class feared solidarity between different oppressed groups, like between Irish workers and enslaved people.
Yes, he uses the observations of Fanny Kemble, the wife of a Georgia planter, who wrote about the white Irish immigrant laborers working alongside enslaved people on a canal project. They're deliberately segregated. Kemble feared that the Irish, whom she described as passionate, impulsive, warm-hearted, generous, might actually take to sympathy with the slaves. She worried about the possible consequences of such solidarity.
A revealing glimpse into the strategic use of racial division.
Absolutely. It underscores the ruling class's profound fear of class solidarity across racial lines and their active efforts to prevent it. Keep the oppressed divided, and you maintain control.
And enslaved people found ways to maintain their humanity and culture even within the system.
Definitely. Zinn, drawing on the work of Lawrence Levine, describes this resistance as often pre-political. It was expressed in countless ways in daily life, in culture, music, magic, folk tales, art, religion. These were all vital ways for enslaved people to hold on to their humanity, to carve out a space of dignity and meaning, to resist the total dehumanization this system tried to impose.
Like the spirituals.
Exactly. Songs like "No More Peccacorn for Me," "No More Driver's Lash for Me" speak volumes about this enduring spirit of defiance and hope for liberation. It was this constant defiant hum beneath the surface of apparent submission.
And free the interns. Black individuals in the North were crucial voices in the abolitionist movement, often more radical than their white counterparts.
Powerful, undeniable voices. Zinn highlights figures like David Walker, whose Walker's appeal was so potent it terrified slaveholders, directly challenging the foundations of their system with calls for black resistance. Henry Highland Garnet issued a bold call for defiance against the fugitive slave law, urging escaped slaves, "Send on your bloodhounds, I will not live a slave, and if force is employed, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man." This was a direct call for militant self-defense.
Really rejecting the pacifist approach some white abolitionists favored.
Yes. And J.W. Logan's letter is another incredible example Zinn uses. Logan, an escaped slave himself, refused his former enslaver's demand for $1,000 for his freedom. He challenges her with searing questions. Did you raise your own children for the market? Have you got to learn that human rights are mutual and reciprocal, and if you take my liberty in life, you forfeit your own liberty in life?
Wow. Turning the logic of property and rights back on the enslaver.
Completely. It strips away any pretense of benevolence. Logan, like Zinn himself, forces us, the reader, you the listener, to confront the core injustice and the inherent hypocrisy. It makes you ask, what does justice even mean in this context?
And Frederick Douglass, of course, famously exposed the hypocrisy of celebrating Independence Day while slavery existed.
His 1852 speech is devastatingly powerful. He asked, "What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" It's a direct confrontation with American hypocrisy.
Zinn also notes the tension within the abolitionist movement.
Yes. What's particularly compelling here is the consistent struggle Zinn documents of black abolitionists against what he calls the unconscious racism of white abolitionists. Black activists insisted on having their own independent voice. Douglass, starting his newspaper North Star, is a key example. A conference of black leaders in 1854 declared, "It is emphatically our battle. No one else can fight it for us. Instead of depending upon it, we must lead it."
Highlighting self-determination and black agency as crucial.
Absolutely. Even John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, often portrayed as a white-led action, Zinn reminds us included 5 black men in the striking force. 2 were killed, 2 were later hanged. Direct participation, often forgotten, in armed resistance.
Now let's talk about Lincoln and the Civil War. Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, but Zinn presents a more complex picture.
Much more complex. Zinn, drawing on historians like Richard Hofstadter, describes Lincoln as politically cautious, even uncompromising in his insistence on moderation regarding slavery, especially early on. He famously refused to denounce the fugitive slave law publicly, saying privately, "I bite my lips and keep quiet." This challenges that simple narrative of Lincoln as a lifelong, fervent abolitionist. He was a pragmatic politician navigating immense pressures.
And even his early proposals were compromises.
Yes. As a congressman in 1849, Lincoln proposed abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., but his bill also required city authorities to arrest and return fugitive slaves escaping into the city. This earned him the moniker "that slave hound from Illinois" from the radical abolitionist Wendell Phillips. It really raises that important question about political action versus personal beliefs. How much was principle? How much was expediency?
And the initial goal of the war wasn't emancipation.
The official goal, as declared by Congress even after the war began in 1861, was crystal clear. A resolution passed overwhelmingly stated the war was not waged for any purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights of established institutions, meaning slavery of those states, but to preserve the Union.
Preserve the Union, slavery intact if necessary.
That was the initial stance: protect property rights, maintain the nation's economic and territorial integrity. Emancipation was forced onto the agenda later.
By abolitionists and by the actions of enslaved people themselves.
Exactly. Abolitionists like Wendell Phillips relentlessly pushed the issue, declaring, "Abraham Lincoln may not wish it, he cannot prevent it. The Negro is the pebble in the cogwheel, and the machine cannot go on until you get him out." Ew! And the pressure from citizens was immense. Zinn notes that after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was initially limited, anti-slavery forces gathered 400,000 signatures for legislation to end slavery permanently by 1864, and an unprecedented public petition drive.
And the role of black soldiers was critical in shifting the war's purpose.
Hugely critical. The more black soldiers joined the Union Army, eventually nearly 200,000 served, the more the war appeared to be, and in some ways became, a war for liberation. It changed the political and moral calculus.
But this shift also created tensions in the North. Zinn discusses the draft riots.
Yes, this is crucial. The Emancipation Proclamation, combined with draft laws that allowed wealthy men to buy their way out of service for $300, fueled intense resentment among poor white workers in the North. This erupted horrifically in the draft riots of 1863, particularly in New York City. It became an orgy of death and violence, Zinn calls it, shockingly targeting black individuals and communities, lynching people, burning homes and orphanages.
Blaming black people for the war and for their own economic hardship.
Exactly. It reveals this deep-seated class resentment being tragically racialized and redirected away from the wealthy elite who are avoiding service. It shows how systemic issues are often deflected onto other oppressed groups, fracturing potential solidarity.
And Zinn emphasizes that enslaved people weren't just passively waiting for freedom. They were actively involved in securing it.
Absolutely. He provides powerful instances of active, courageous resistance during the war. In Mississippi, enslaved people drove off overseers and divided land amongst themselves. In Arkansas, there was a conspiracy to kill enslavers. In Kentucky, instances of burning houses and parading for Lincoln.
Real, direct action.
Yes, and the story of Robert Smalls is incredible. A former enslaved man working on a Confederate steamship, the Planter, he commandeered it, sailed it past Confederate forts with his family and other enslaved people, and delivered it to the Union Navy. A stunning act of bravery and skill.
So their contribution was vital to the Union victory.
Zinn cites historian James McPherson, who argues forcefully, without their help, the North could not have won the war as soon as it did, and perhaps it could not have won at all. It underscores the critical, active role of black Americans in their own liberation and the Union's success.
After the war, Reconstruction begins. But Zinn quotes a former slave, Thomas Hall, expressing deep disillusionment.
Yes, Hall's observation is incredibly poignant and captures the limitations of formal freedom without economic justice. He said, "Lincoln got the praise for freeing us, but did he do it? He gave us freedom without giving us any chance to live to ourselves, and we still had to depend on the Southern white man for work, food, and clothing, and he held us out of necessity and want in a state of servitude, but little better than slavery."
Freedom on paper, but still dependent.
Exactly. It highlights Zinn's enduring theme. Legal declarations don't automatically translate to actual freedom without fundamental economic and social change. It challenges that notion of a complete, immediate liberation achieved by the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment alone.
But there were real gains during Reconstruction, however brief.
Yes, Zinn acknowledges that. He argues the government's true motive for the war was primarily economic, to retain the enormous national territory and market and resources. However, he says, the momentum of that crusade brought new forces into national politics. This led to a brief, remarkable period where black Americans in the South voted, elected black officials to state legislatures and even Congress, and established free, often racially mixed public education systems for the first time.
And the constitutional amendments.
Crucial. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, established birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, and prohibited denying the vote based on race. Legally, they repudiated the racist Dred Scott decision and created a framework for equality, a powerful, albeit temporary gain carved out by immense struggle.
But Zinn emphasizes how short-lived this progress was. What led to the end of Reconstruction?
It was tragically short-lived, illustrating how quickly systemic power reasserts itself. Zinn points to the Compromise of 1877 as a final nail in the coffin. Fueled by a national economic depression in the 1870s, rising labor and farmer radicalism that scared the Northern elites, and a disputed presidential election, Northern Republicans essentially made a deal with Southern Democrats.
A backroom deal.
A political deal. The Republicans got the presidency, Rutherford B. Hayes, and in return, they agreed to remove the remaining federal troops from the South. This effectively abandoned black citizens to the control of white Southern elites, ensuring the return of white supremacy.
And economic motives were central to this compromise.
Zinn argues they were. Historian C. Van Woodward, whom Zinn cites, notes the compromise did assure the dominant whites political autonomy and non-intervention in matters of race policy, but also promised them a share in the blessings of the new economic order, meaning federal support for industrial development, railroads, etc. in the South. It was about national capitalist unity over racial justice.
And Zinn uses another historian, Horace Mann Bond, to drive this point home about Alabama.
Yes, Bond's study of Alabama Reconstruction showed that the northern industrialists and financiers moving into the state, the accumulations of capital, and the men who controlled them were, as Bond put it, as unaffected by attitudinal prejudices as it is possible to be. They weren't necessarily driven by deep personal racism, but they cynically used existing racism to their own account, manipulating racial tensions to divide labor, control politics, and solidify a new form of economic exploitation.
Which led to a terrible downturn for Black Americans.
A devastating downturn. Zinn calls it a low point for Black people in America. He quotes Thomas Fortune, a prominent Black editor testifying in 1883 about the aftermath. Widespread poverty, government betrayal, and the rise of sharecropping and the Krupplian system. Fortune described it as a system of fraud, where Black farmers were paid in orders usable only at the planter's or storekeeper's store at inflated prices, and kept forever in debt, essentially creating a new form of servitude tied to land and debt.
So without fundamental economic justice, legal freedom remained an illusion.
That's Zinn's persistent critique. It powerfully challenges those traditional narratives that portray Reconstruction as merely a failed political experiment, instead highlighting its deliberate dismantling in favor of economic interests and white supremacy.
Okay, let's shift into the late 19th century, the Gilded Age. Zinn paints a picture of incredible technological progress alongside crushing poverty. He mentions agriculture.
Right. Mechanization was transforming farming. Zinn notes figures showing wheat production time being radically cut from 61 hours per acre to just 3 hours and 19 minutes by 1900 using machinery. Incredible efficiency gains.
But this progress came at a steep cost for the individual farmer.
A huge cost. It highlights that uneven distribution of benefits. While production became more efficient, farmers had to borrow heavily from banks to afford the expensive new machines and land. Then they got trapped in a cycle of debt. Prices for their crops were falling due to overproduction, while the costs charged by monopolistic railroads to transport their goods and the interest rates charged by banks kept rising.
So they were squeezed from both ends.
Completely squeezed. The individual farmer, unlike the monopolist railroad and the monopolist banker, as Zinn calls them, had absolutely no control over pricing. This led to widespread economic despair and fueled the populist movement. It captures Zinn's focus on how technological progress within an unregulated capitalist system can actually concentrate wealth and exacerbate inequality.
And Zinn emphasizes the systemic corruption underpinning this era. The railroads seem like a key example.
A prime example of how political power was overtly used to enrich corporate elites at public expense. He details the Union Pacific Railroad deal. They received millions of acres of free land from the government, plus millions in government bonds. Then they set up a fraudulent construction company called Credit Mobilier, essentially paying themselves inflated prices for the construction work. Zinn cites figures like $94 million paid for work that actually cost $44 million.
And how did they get away with it?
By bribing politicians. They sold shares in Credit Mobilier cheaply or gave them outright to influential congressmen to prevent investigation. It was blatant corruption, woven into the fabric of industrial expansion.
And the great industrialists of the era? The Carnegies, Rockefellers, Morgan, Zinn, argues their fortunes were built on exploitation and privilege.
Yes, he paints a stark picture. He points out that many of these titans of industry, like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, avoided serving in the Civil War by paying for substitutes, while working-class men fought and died. He details Morgan's firm getting a $5 million commission for handling a government bond issue that could have been sold directly. Rockefeller using secret railroad rebates to crush competitors and build the Standard Oil monopoly. Carnegie's steel empire built on low wages and brutal working conditions.
Like a U.S. Steel.
Exactly. Morgan formed U.S. Steel, selling overvalued stocks and bonds for a massive fee. Zinn says $150 million. This empire was sustained by protective tariffs and, critically, by working 200,000 men 12 hours a day for wages that barely kept their families alive. It's a stark illustration of how immense wealth was built on exploitation and government favor, not just ingenuity.
And even government attempts at reform during this period, Zinn argues, often ended up benefiting the wealthy.
That's a key part of his critique. He uses President Cleveland as an example again. Cleveland vetoed a modest $100,000 relief bill for drought-stricken Texas farmers, claiming it would weaken the sturdiness of our national character. Noble sentiment, perhaps. But in that same year, Zinn points out, Cleveland approved paying off wealthy government bondholders at a premium, giving them $28 above the $100 face value for each bond, essentially a $45 million gift to the rich.
Wow. The contrast is stark. Sturdiness for the poor, handouts for the rich.
Precisely. It showcases a blatant disparity in government priorities, consistently favoring elite wealth over widespread suffering.
What about attempts to regulate industries, like the Interstate Commerce Act for railroads? Wasn't that supposed to help the public?
It was presented that way. But Zinn, drawing on contemporary sources, argues it was actually welcomed by some railroad interests. He quotes Richard Olney, a top railroad lawyer who would soon become Cleveland's attorney general. Olney advised railroad presidents that the act could be beneficial from a railroad point of view because it could pacify public agitation, while the law itself could be shaped or interpreted favorably by the courts, which were staffed by judges sympathetic to corporations.
So, regulation as a way to manage public anger, not necessarily to curb corporate power.
That's the argument. And Zinn notes that Supreme Court justices, often former railroad lawyers themselves, consistently interpreted the law in ways that favored capitalist development. He cites legal historian Morton Horwitz on how older common law principles, like ensuring a fair price, were discarded in favor of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, fundamentally shifting the legal landscape to favor business growth over consumer or worker protection.
And this pro-business ideology was openly stated.
Often, yes. Zinn quotes Justice David J. Brewer, who asserted in 1893 that it was natural and right that the wealth of the community will be in the hands of the few. He also claimed, reflecting the harsh social Darwinist views of the time, that there is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings.
Blaming the victim on a grand scale.
Entirely. Meanwhile, these same millionaires, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, were funding universities and libraries, creating this philanthropic facade that Zinn argues often masked the exploitative origins of their fortunes. It's a contrast he constantly draws attention to the public image versus the underlying reality of class power.
So, faced with these conditions, how did workers and farmers respond? Zinn highlights major labor uprisings.
Yes, the late 19th century saw enormous labor conflict. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was a pivotal moment, shaking the nation like nothing before. It wasn't just about wages. Zinn notes it was also about the incredibly dangerous working conditions, workers constantly losing limbs, being crushed between cars. The human cost of industrial expansion was immense.
Where did the 1877 strike begin?
It started in Martinsburg, West Virginia, after yet another wage cut. Workers simply uncoupled engines and declared no trains would run until the cut was rescinded. When the state militia arrived and shot and killed a striker who refused to move, the conflict exploded.
It spread rapidly.
Like wildfire. Across states, workers walked off jobs, seized railroad property, clashed with militia and federal troops. It terrorized large parts of the country, a powerful example of spontaneous grassroots resistance.
But the established unions didn't support it.
Tellingly, no. Zinn notes that the leaders of the major railroad brotherhoods quickly disavowed the strike, condemning the violence and disorder. It showed an early and persistent divide between the militancy of rank-and-file workers and the more conservative stance of established union leadership.
Then came the fight for the 8-hour day, leading to Haymarket.
Yes, the movement for an 8-hour workday gained huge momentum, culminating in a massive general strike call for May 1st, 1886. Around 350,000 workers walked out nationwide. In Chicago, the center of the movement, 40,000 struck, paralyzing key industries like the stockyards. Business leaders reacted with fear and aggression, forming a citizens' committee, demanding militia and police intervention. The Chicago Mail newspaper explicitly called for watching anarchist leaders like Albert Parsons and August Spies, holding them personally responsible for any trouble.
Setting the stage for confrontation.
Exactly. Then came the Haymarket Square incident. After police killed striking workers at the McCormick Harvester plant, a protest rally was called. During the rally, a bomb was thrown at police by an unknown person, and the police responded by firing wildly into the crowd. Several police and workers were killed. The aftermath saw mass arrests, a show trial focusing on anarchist leaders, despite lack of evidence linking them to the bombing, and executions. Zinn presents it as a brutal example of violent state suppression of the labor movement, using the bombing as a pretext to crush radical leadership.
And the Homestead Strike, another iconic conflict.
Homestead, 1892, at Carnegie Steel. While Carnegie himself was conveniently away in Scotland, his manager, the notoriously anti-union Henry Clay Frick, cut wages. When the union refused the cuts, Frick locked them out, built a massive barbed wire fence around the plant, Fort Frick, they called it, and hired 300 Pinkerton private detectives to protect strikebreakers.
Essentially declaring war on his workforce.
An outright declaration of war. The workers fought back, famously battling the Pinkertons on the Monongahela River, forcing them to surrender. But ultimately, the state militia intervened on the side of the company. The strike was broken, and the union was crushed at Homestead for decades. It illustrated the extreme measures capitalists backed by state power would take to destroy organized labor.
Then the Depression of 1893 hit, leading to even more unrest.
A devastating depression, triggered, as Zinn argues, by the inherent instability of the system, wild industrial growth, financial manipulation, uncontrolled speculation, and profiteering. It threw millions out of work. Maybe 3 million people. City governments struggled to cope, setting up soup kitchens and some work programs, but state and federal governments offered almost no relief, reinforcing that idea that the system wasn't designed to help the poor.
And dissenters were punished. Zinn mentions Emma Goldman.
Yes. Emma Goldman, the anarchist orator, was jailed for urging hungry, unemployed people in New York to take direct action, to take bread from stores if they were starving. It shows the system's intolerance for any direct challenge to property rights, even in the face of mass suffering.
In this period, radicalized figures like Eugene Debs.
Profoundly. Debs, who led the American Railway Union during the massive Pullman strike of 1894, was initially more moderate, even opposing strikes sometimes. But the experience of the 1893 Depression, the brutality used to crush the Pullman strike, federal troops' injunctions, and his subsequent imprisonment radicalized him completely. It was during his prison term that he famously read socialist literature and emerged a committed socialist. He declared, "The issue is socialism versus capitalism. I am for socialism because I am for humanity." A clear shift towards a fundamental critique of the entire economic system, born from direct experience of its injustices.
Alongside labor unrest, farmers were organizing too, right? The populist movement.
Yes. In the late 19th century, facing crushing debt, falling prices, and exploitation by railroads and banks, desperate farmers formed organizations like the Farmers' Alliance. This grew into a powerful political movement, populism. In 1886, the Texas Alliance issued the Cleburne Demands, a foundational populist document. It called for government action against arrogant capitalists and powerful corporations, demanding regulation of railroad rates, currency reform, and other measures to protect farmers and workers.
A direct challenge to corporate power from the agricultural heartland.
A major challenge. They even tried to bypass the existing system by forming cooperatives, like the Texas Exchange, aiming to pool their cotton and sell it collectively to get better prices. But Zinn notes these efforts often failed. Banks refused them loans, and the farmers themselves were too poor to raise enough capital on their own. This defeat, particularly, convinced many alliances that monetary reform was crucial. They needed government action to change the financial system itself.
And their struggle was captured in their culture. Songs.
Yes, populist songs like "The Farmer is the Man" vividly reflected their struggle against the power of credit, debt, and monopolies. The farmer is the man, the farmer is the man, lives on credit till the fall. It captured the feeling of being exploited by the entire system.
But the populist movement faced huge challenges in uniting people. Zinn mentions racism.
A critical hurdle. Racism, especially in the South, was actively exploited by the established Democratic Party to prevent a powerful alliance between poor white farmers and poor black farmers, who often faced the same economic hardships.
Divide and conquer again.
Exactly. Southern elites stoked racial fears to maintain control. And Zinn details how Southern states systematically implemented discriminatory measures, poll taxes, literacy tests, property qualifications, grandfather clauses, all designed to disenfranchise black voters, but also catching many poor whites in the net. This fractured potential class solidarity along racial lines.
And ultimately, Zinn argues, the populist movement was weakened by electoral politics.
Yes. Despite widespread popular sympathy for movements like Coxey's Army, a march of the unemployed on Washington, and the Pullman strikers among farmers, Zinn argues the lure of achieving power through the existing political system ultimately diluted populism's radical potential. By fusing with the Democratic Party in the 1896 election, nominating William Jennings Bryan, populism was effectively absorbed and drowned in a sea of Democratic politics. Its radical edge was blunted, agrarian radicals were replaced by political brokers, and the movement lost its independent force.
So the system managed to contain the threat.
Zinn sees it as a consolidation of the system against mass movements. The The crushing of major labor strikes like Pullman and Homestead, the final brutal massacres of Native Americans like the one at Wounded Knee in 1890, which Zinn calls the climax of 400 years of violence, and the absorption of populism all worked together, in his view, to solidify the control of industrial capitalism and prevent fundamental change.
Okay, let's turn to American expansionism and imperialism.
Yeah.
Zinn argues this wasn't a new phenomenon in the late 19th century, right?
Not at all. He highlights a less discussed yet pervasive aspect of U.S. history, its long record of military interventions abroad before the Spanish-American War. He cites a State Department list compiled later showing 103 interventions between 1798 and 1895 in Argentina, Uruguay, China, Angola, and significantly in Japan, where U.S. warships under Commodore Perry forced open Japanese ports to American trade in the 1850s, interventions in Nicaragua, and even Hawaii, where the U.S. military helped overthrow the Queen and promote a provisional government favorable to American sugar interests.
So a consistent pattern of projecting American power globally, often for economic reasons, long before 1898.
Exactly. It challenges that traditional narrative of America as primarily isolationist until the turn of the 20th century. Zinn argues expansionism was always part of the agenda.
So how does he view the Spanish-American War of 1898? The standard story often involves liberating Cuba, the sinking of the Maine.
Zinn cuts through that narrative, arguing it was driven primarily by business interests and a desire for economic stability and expansion. He quotes bankers, brokers, powerful businessmen like Russell Sage and J.P. Morgan, who explicitly desired war or intervention in Cuba to settle the unrest, which was disrupting trade and investments. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a key imperialist figure and advisor to President McKinley, reported that everybody wanted the Cuban question solved, including the most conservative classes, like businessmen, because the ongoing rebellion was causing economic spasms and uncertainty.
So solve the Cuban problem to stabilize the American economy and open new markets.
That's the underlying motivation Zinn points to, not primarily humanitarian concern for the Cubans.
And he draws a stark contrast between the outrage over the Maine and the silence over domestic violence against workers.
Yes, it's a powerful point. He quotes the Journal of the International Association of Machinists, which noted the huge national clamor and calls for war after the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 268 sailors. But just a year earlier, in 1897, was the Latimer Massacre in Pennsylvania, where sheriff's deputies shot down 19 unarmed striking coal miners, mostly immigrants, many shot in the back as they fled. That event received almost no outcry in the press, no calls for federal intervention.
It illustrates a chilling difference in whose lives mattered, whose deaths warranted national outrage.
Absolutely. It exposes a deep hypocrisy, Zinn suggests, in the humanitarian claims used to justify foreign intervention, while ignoring or downplaying violence against workers and minorities at home.
And after the war, Zinn notes, the U.S. essentially ignored the Cuban rebels who had been fighting for independence for years.
Yes, American historians, Zinn points out, often sideline the role of the Cuban rebels themselves. He highlights figures like General Calixto Garcia, a leader of the Cuban insurgency, who fiercely protested being excluded from the Spanish surrender negotiations and the subsequent American military occupation and appointment of authorities not elected by the Cuban people.
So the U.S. took over from Spain, sidelining the actual Cuban independence movement.
Pretty much. And after the war, American capital flooded into Cuba. Zinn details corporations like United Fruit buying up vast tracts of land, 1.9 million acres, for as little as 20 cents an acre, taking over railroads, mines, and sugar properties. The Platt Amendment, forced into the Cuban Constitution, gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit. Zinn, echoing Cuban sentiment, calls it a betrayal that established colonial vassalage despite all the earlier talk of Cuban freedom. Economic control, not genuine independence, was the outcome.
Then came the Philippines, acquired from Spain in the same treaty. McKinley's justification for annexing it is quite something.
It's frankly chilling, and Zinn quotes it directly to reveal the imperial mindset. McKinley claimed he prayed for guidance and concluded Americans could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. He said the U.S. had a duty to educate, uplift, and civilize and Christianize them. It's this potent, self-serving blend of religious duty, racial superiority, the idea of Filipino incapacity, and implicitly economic and strategic interest, all used to justify conquest.
But the Filipinos didn't want to be uplifted and civilized by the U.S.
They certainly did not. They had already declared independence from Spain and established a republic under Emilio Aguinaldo, whom the U.S. had initially supported against the Spanish. When they realized the U.S. intended to rule them, they rose in revolt in 1899, leading to the brutal Philippine-American War.
And Zinn uses soldiers' letters to reveal the reality of that war.
Yes, unfiltered accounts from the ground. Letters describing burning villages. Caloocan contains not one living native, one captain wrote. A private admitting he had, with my own hand, set fire to over 50 houses of Filipinos. The racism and dehumanization are blatant. One volunteer wrote back home, "This shooting human beings beats rabbit hunting all to pieces." Soldiers admitted to using torture, like the water cure, and summarily executing prisoners.
It raises that profound question again about the true cost of empire and the dehumanization involved.
Absolutely. Zinn argues this brutality was intensified because it occurred during a period of intense domestic racism in the U.S., the height of Jim Crow and lynching. Between 1889 and 1903, Zinn notes, an average of 2 black individuals were lynched every week in the United States. The Filipino people, being brown-skinned, physically identifiable, strange-speaking, and strange-looking to American soldiers steeped in this racism, became easy targets for extreme violence and dehumanization. The patterns of racial oppression at home were projected onto the new colonial subjects.
And the scale of the killing was immense.
Horrific. Zinn quotes the Manila correspondent of the Philadelphia Ledger reporting in 1901. Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners, and captives, active insurgents, and suspected people from lads of 10 up. The idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog. He presents it as a systematic campaign of terror, a war of extermination aimed at crushing resistance, mirroring the earlier patterns Zinn identified with the Arawaks and Native Americans, its history repeating itself, driven by imperial ambition.
Let's move forward to World War I. Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric was very idealistic. A war to end all wars, make the world safe for democracy. Did the American public buy into that initially?
Zinn argues, not really. Despite Wilson's soaring rhetoric, there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm for entering the European conflict. He points out that in the first 6 weeks after the U.S. declared war, only 73,000 men volunteered, far short of the million needed.
So conscription was necessary almost immediately.
Congress swiftly voted for a draft. This fundamental lack of popular enthusiasm at the outset challenges that traditional narrative of a unified nation eagerly rushing off to fight for democracy. Zinn suggests deep skepticism among ordinary citizens about getting involved in a European war.
So the government had to work hard to sell the war.
Extremely hard. George Creel's Committee on Public Information, CPI, was created specifically for this purpose. It launched a massive propaganda campaign. Zinn details how the CPI deployed 75,000 speakers, the 4-Minute Men, who gave short patriotic speeches in theaters, churches, public gatherings across the country, explicitly designed to whip up pro-war fervor in a reluctant public.
But even with this propaganda barrage, there was still opposition.
Significant opposition. Zinn highlights that socialists who campaigned on an anti-war platform made remarkable gains in municipal elections in 1917, even after the U.S. entered the war. They got 22% of the vote for mayor in New York City, substantial increases in Chicago, Buffalo, and other cities. This showed persistent anti-war sentiment among a large segment of the populace, especially the working class, even in the face of intense government pressure and propaganda.
And how did the government respond to this dissent? Zinn focuses on suppression.
Swiftly and severely. What's particularly telling is the passage of the Espionage Act just 2 months after the war declaration, followed by the Sedition Act. These laws were used broadly to crush anti-war speech and activism. Zinn details arrests like that of Charles Schenck, a Socialist Party official who distributed leaflets denouncing the draft as involuntary servitude imposed by Wall Street interests. He wasn't advocating violence, just urging people to petition against the draft.
And he was arrested and convicted for that.
Yes, sentenced to 6 months in jail. His case went to the Supreme Court, which upheld his conviction using the famous clear and present danger doctrine.
Zinn questions that doctrine's application here, doesn't he?
He poses a profound question. Was not the war itself a clear and present danger? More dangerous to life than any argument against it. He flips the logic, suggesting the real danger was the war, not the dissent against it. And Zinn documents the broader atmosphere of repression. Vigilante groups attacking anti-war activists, especially radicals like the IWW, newspapers cooperating with the government, The post office banning dissenting publications, and the attorney general boasting the country was so thoroughly policed.
A real climate of fear.
A pervasive suppression of anti-war voices. Zinn also details the brutal treatment of conscientious objectors in military prisons, beatings, solitary confinement, torture. It reinforces his argument that wartime often serves as a pretext to crush dissent, consolidate power, and enforce conformity.
Okay, moving past WWI into the period leading up to the Great Depression and WWII. Zinn highlights continued labor militancy even in the supposedly prosperous 1920s.
Yes, he points to the Seattle General Strike of February 1919 as a major example. The idea came from the radical industrial workers of the world, IWW, but it became a reality involving mainstream AFL unions too. It brought the entire city to a standstill for 5 days, with 100,000 workers walking out. Even though the IWW leadership was mostly in jail at the time, it showed this deep undercurrent of working-class militancy and organizing capacity simmering beneath the surface of the Roaring '20s.
But unity was still a challenge.
Always a challenge. Zinn notes tensions between the IWW and the more conservative AFL locals. And significantly, while Japanese worker locals were admitted to the General Strike Committee, they weren't given a vote, showing the persistence of racial divisions even within the labor movement. Still, the fact that 60,000 union members and 40,000 other workers joined in sympathy demonstrated significant solidarity across different labor groups, terrifying the authorities.
And Zinn uses literature, like Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt, to capture the feeling of the era.
Yes, he sees Babbitt as perfectly capturing the false sense of prosperity, the superficiality, the focus on gadgets and conformity among the middle classes, while ignoring the underlying discontent and the economic inequalities that would soon lead to the crash. It highlights that disconnect between the surface image and the deeper reality.
And even during the Depression itself, Zinn finds examples of people speaking out, understanding the systemic issues.
Absolutely. He includes a letter from a New York City housewife responding to a government bulletin about meat prices. She didn't just complain about prices, she said, "What we want is the help of your department on the meat profiteers who are keeping the hardworking people from obtaining proper nourishment."
Directly blaming corporate greed, not just market forces.
Exactly. It shows a clear grasp of the economic forces at play and a demand for government intervention against corporate power, not just for abstract relief.
And government policy before the crash seemed to worsen inequality. Zinn mentions the Mellon Plan.
Right, the tax cuts pushed by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon in the 1920s. Zinn highlights how they drastically lowered tax rates for the highest income brackets from a top rate of 50% down to 25%, while offering minimal relief to the lowest earners. This clearly demonstrates the government's continued alignment with the wealthy, a consistent theme in Zinn's analysis. These policies actively funneled wealth upwards even as the economy was becoming increasingly unstable, creating a system ripe for collapse and widespread suffering.
When the Depression hit hard, Zinn emphasizes the role of grassroots organizing in demanding relief, like the unemployed councils.
Yes. These councils, often initiated or organized by communists and socialists, but involving many non-affiliated unemployed workers, were crucial. Zinn argues they played a key role in pushing reluctant local governments to provide relief and resisting evictions. He gives the example of Lincoln Park, Michigan, where a council of 300 members, with only 11 communists among them, successfully organized mass actions to pressure authorities for rent relief. It highlights how a small, dedicated group could mobilize broader community support and achieve concrete gains, demonstrating real grassroots power.
And similar organizing happened in the rural South, even across racial lines.
Remarkably so. Zinn details the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, STFU, formed in Arkansas in the mid-1930s. It was composed of both black and white sharecroppers and tenant farmers organizing together in a deeply segregated society. They organized strikes and protests against the planters and, significantly, against the negative impacts of Roosevelt's New Deal AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act policies. The AAA paid large landowners to reduce acreage, which often resulted in them evicting tenants and sharecroppers, hitting the poorest the hardest.
So an interracial alliance fighting against government policies that hurt them.
A powerful example of interracial class solidarity and resistance in the face of incredible obstacles. It shows people coming together across racial lines for economic justice, directly challenging policies that favored the powerful landowners.
And the 1930s also saw the rise of new labor tactics, like the sit-down strikes. Zinn focuses on the Flint strike.
The sit-down strikes were incredibly effective and showed remarkable self-organization. Zinn vividly describes the pivotal strike at the General Motors Fisher Body plant in Flint, Michigan, starting in late 1936. Workers occupied the plant for over 40 days. Inside, they created this functioning community committees for food, recreation, information, sanitation, self-defense. They resisted court injunctions, police attacks, using fire hoses to drive back police who tried to storm the plant, even after 13 strikers were wounded by gunfire, and spread the strike to other GM plants.
Real militancy and organization.
Absolutely. And this collective action, this refusal to leave the point of production, ultimately forced the giant General Motors Corporation, previously staunchly anti-union, to recognize and negotiate with the United Auto Workers, UAW. It was a massive victory demonstrating the power of organized militant labor.
But Zinn also suggests that even with gains, the system finds ways to manage dissent. He talks about WWII and its aftermath.
Yes, what's particularly illuminating is his point about wartime strikes. Even with wartime no-strike pledges from major union leaders and government controls that kept wages down while corporate profits soared, rank-and-file workers continued to strike. Zinn notes there were actually more strikes in 1944 than in any previous year in American history. Thousands of small, unauthorized wildcat strikes.
So discontent continued even during a popular war.
Persistent discontent. This highlights, for Zinn, the enduring dilemma of working people in the United States. The system, he argues, is adept at responding to rebellions with a combination of new forms of control, like wartime regulations, balanced with new concessions, like slightly higher wages or benefits eventually. These concessions, Zinn notes, often didn't solve the basic problems for many, but they helped enough people, created enough of an atmosphere of progress to restore some faith in the system and prevent a full-scale revolt, while still maintaining the core power structures of corporate dominance.
Now let's look at World War II itself. Zinn challenges the dominant narrative about why the U.S. entered the war, right?
Okay.
He questions the focus on Pearl Harbor as the sole catalyst.
He does. He contends that U.S. entry wasn't primarily about fighting fascism or defending human rights, but about protecting and expanding American national power and economic interests, particularly in the Pacific. While traditional narratives focus on the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, Zinn calls Pearl Harbor a link in the American Pacific Empire. He points out that the U.S. didn't go to war when Japan invaded China in the 1930s or bombed civilians in Nanking in 1937. Intervention only came when Japan directly threatened U.S. territory and, crucially, U.S. economic interests in Southeast Asia.
What specific interests?
Zinn argues the U.S. had largely accepted Japan's expansion in China, special interests they called it, until Japan moved southward, threatening U.S. access to vital resources like tin, rubber, and oil from Southeast Asia, Malaya, Dutch East Indies. It was the U.S. embargoes on oil and scrap metal, aimed at stopping the southward expansion and protecting those resources and markets, that Zinn argues provoked the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It reframes the conflict around economic competition and imperial rivalry, not just ideology.
And Zinn draws a parallel between Axis atrocities and Allied actions during the war, specifically the bombing campaigns.
Yes, he directly confronts the issue of Allied bombing. While President Roosevelt rightly condemned the inhuman barbarism of Axis bombings of civilian centers, Zinn argues the Allied saturation bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities were often far larger and more destructive. He talks about the 1,000-plane raids on cities like Hamburg and Berlin, culminating in the horrific firestorm bombing of Dresden in early 1945. Dresden was a city crowded with refugees, not a primary military target, yet the bombing killed upwards of 100,000 people, possibly more than died initially at Hiroshima.
And this is often downplayed in Western accounts.
Very much so. Zinn quotes Churchill's memoirs mentioning Dresden almost casually. "We made a heavy raid." This stark contrast between the scale of the devastation and the official memory reveals, for Zinn, a selective historical narrative that often overlooks or justifies Allied atrocities in the name of a good war.
Then there's the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Zinn critically examines the justification for using them.
Yes. He challenges the official narrative that the bombs were absolutely necessary to end the war and save American lives. He presents evidence, including findings from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war, suggesting Japan was already in a hopeless strategic position by the summer of 1945, blockaded and firebombed, and might well have surrendered soon even without the atomic bombs, especially if the U.S. had clarified terms regarding the emperor's status, which they ultimately allowed anyway.
So why were they dropped, according to Zinn's sources and analysis?
He raises several possibilities, questioning the official rationale. Was it bureaucratic momentum, too much money and effort invested in the Manhattan Project not to use the weapon? Was it dropped partly as a demonstration of power aimed at the Soviet Union, marking the start of the Cold War? He also refutes Truman's initial claim that Hiroshima was primarily a military base. The bombing survey itself stated targets were chosen for their concentration of activities and population. And the second bomb on Nagasaki, a different type, plutonium, killed thousands more civilians and even some American POWs held nearby, raising the question of whether it served, in part, as a horrific scientific experiment. Zinn forces you to confront these uncomfortable questions.
Beyond the battlefield, Zinn argues the war had profound effects on American society, consolidating control at home.
Yes, this is a crucial part of his argument. The war didn't just establish U.S. global dominance, positioning it to exert immense influence worldwide. It also, he contends, created conditions for effective control at home. How so? The economic turmoil and widespread social unrest of the 1930s, the strikes, the protests, the radical movements were largely pacified, as Zinn puts it, by the greater turmoil of the war.
War brought prosperity, quieting dissent.
It brought higher prices for farmers, higher wages, enough prosperity for enough of the population, fueled by massive government spending, to diffuse the rebellions that had so threatened the system in the 30s. Patriotism and the wartime economy helped restore faith and maintain stability. It suggests war served a dual purpose, defeating foreign enemies and managing domestic discontent.
And this control continued immediately after the war with the rise of the Cold War and anti-communism.
Absolutely. Zinn points to Truman's Executive Order 99-835, establishing a federal employee loyalty program in 1947 as a key step. This program investigated millions of government workers. While it uncovered not a single case of espionage, Zinn emphasizes, it resulted in hundreds being dismissed and thousands resigning under suspicion, often based on secret evidence or association with suspect groups.
Creating a climate of fear.
Exactly. This official red hunt, Zinn argues, fostered a conservative and fearful reaction across the country. It convinced many Americans of the need for absolute security and the preservation of the established order, justifying massive military spending and suppressing dissent. It illustrates how foreign policy, the Cold War, was used to justify domestic control, limit the scope of acceptable political debate, and marginalize radical movements that had gained traction before the war.
Okay, let's look at the post-war era and the rise of major social movements. Zinn discusses the Black Revolt of the 1950s and 60s. He argues it wasn't sudden, right?
No, not sudden at all, though it might have seemed that way to many white Americans. Zinn emphasizes it was fueled by generations of oppression, the memory of oppressed people, combined with the living presence of daily segregation, lynching, discrimination, and humiliation. This deep historical wellspring of grievance meant that, as Zinn puts it, revolt is always an inch below the surface, just waiting for the right sparks, the right organization to ignite.
And there was a history of activism and cultural resistance long before the 1950s.
Absolutely. Zinn highlights the powerful voices of literary figures like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, who captured the essence of Black identity and protest in the preceding decades. He also notes the role of organizations, including the Communist Party, which gained some Black support through its active anti-racist organizing, like its defense work in the famous Scottsboro case in the 1930s, or Angelo Herndon's work organizing interracial unemployment councils in Atlanta, which actually secured relief for jobless people despite fierce opposition and Herndon's arrest for insurrection.
So the roots of the movement ran deep. Zinn also connects the timing of the Civil Rights Movement to the Cold War.
Yes, what's particularly revealing here is his argument about how the Cold War, ironically, influenced U.S. race policy. As the U.S. competed with the Soviet Union for influence among newly independent nations in Asia and Africa, America's glaring racial hypocrisy segregation, lynching became a major international embarrassment and effective Soviet propaganda. Truman and subsequent administrations realized they had to address the color line, at least superficially, to maintain credibility and present a unified democratic front on the world stage.
So international pressure played a role in domestic policy changes.
Zinn suggests it was a significant factor. The Supreme Court, nearly 90 years after the 14th Amendment supposedly guaranteed equality, finally began to move, ruling against the discriminatory white primary system and, most famously, striking down separate but equal in schools in the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954.
But Brown didn't lead to immediate desegregation.
Far from it. Zinn emphasizes the court's ambiguous ruling of implementing desegregation with all deliberate speed. This vagueness allowed for massive resistance in the South. By 1965, a decade after Brown, over 75% of Southern school districts remained completely segregated. It reveals the huge gap between legal victories and actual change on the ground.
Then came the direct action phase sit-ins, freedom rides. Zinn emphasizes the role of young activists.
Hugely. The Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, started by 4 black college students, were a pivotal moment. Zinn quotes Bob Moses, a key figure in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, recalling seeing a photo of the Greensboro students. They had a sort of sullen, angry, determined look, and he realized this time they were taking the initiative. It sparked a wave of youth-led activism.
And the freedom rides faced intense violence.
Horrific violence, especially in Alabama. Freedom riders, black and white, challenging segregation on interstate buses, were brutally attacked by mobs, often with police complicity or inaction. A bus was firebombed near Anniston. Riders were savagely beaten in Birmingham and Montgomery. Zinn makes a point of citing reports that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover often just watched, took notes, did nothing, while activists were being beaten. This highlights the federal government's reluctance to fully protect civil rights workers early on.
But SNCC and other groups persisted.
Absolutely. SNCC's dedication to nonviolent but militant direct action, working in the most dangerous parts of the Deep South, organizing voter registration drives and local protests against systemic racism, was incredibly courageous and transformative.
Zinn also notes the scale of the movement was massive, yet leaders faced pressure to moderate.
Yes, the scale was immense. Zinn cites figures like 1,412 demonstrations in just 3 months in 1963 alone. Thousands faced police clubs, dogs, and high-powered fire hoses in Birmingham under Bull Connor. Yet, even amidst this mass mobilization and brutal repression, established leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. were often pressured by the Kennedy administration and others to slow down, to be less confrontational.
Like at the March on Washington.
Exactly. John Lewis, then the young chairman of SNCC, had his speech censored at the last minute because it was deemed too critical of the federal government's inaction. Zinn suggests that Malcolm X's fiery rhetoric delivered shortly after the march and the Birmingham church bombing that killed 4 young girls was probably closer to the raw anger felt by many in the black community, revealing that persistent tension between reformist and more radical approaches within the movement.
And the riots, like Watts in 1965, Zinn interprets them not just as chaos, but as expressions of deeper frustrations.
Precisely. The Watts riot, sparked by an incident of police brutality, wasn't just random violence. The McCone Commission report afterwards, Zinn notes, found the underlying causes were pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing, and the concentration of impoverished black people in urban ghettos. Zinn argues these uprisings reflected a new mood in which self-esteem and enhanced racial pride are replacing apathy and submission, a powerful, albeit destructive, assertion of humanity and a refusal to be pacified by token gestures or slow progress.
But the system's response often remained repression or limited concessions. Zinn mentions COINTELPRO.
Yes, the system pushed back hard. The FBI's secret COINTELPRO program, Zinn details, launched hundreds of covert actions, 295 specifically against black groups, aimed at disrupting, discrediting, and neutralizing civil rights and black power organizations, sowing discord, using informants, and even inciting violence. It reveals the government's deliberate efforts to suppress black militancy,
leading to disillusionment for many activists.
Profound disillusionment. Zinn quotes Mrs. Unita Blackwell, a poor black woman activist from Mississippi, after an attempt to occupy unused federal land was rebuffed. She said, "Everything that we have asked for through these years had been handed down on paper. It's never been a reality. We, the poor people of Mississippi, is tired. So we're going to build for ourselves because we don't have a government that represents us."
Wow. That captures the deep sense of betrayal and the turn towards self-reliance and community control born from that disillusionment.
It really does. It highlights that persistent gap between legal promises and lived reality, a central theme in Zinn's account of the civil rights movement and its complex legacy.
Let's turn to another major conflict, the Vietnam War. Zinn's perspective here is obviously highly critical. He frames it as a massive military effort that failed against a determined populace.
Yes, his framing is stark. From 1964 to 1972, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world made a maximum military effort to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country and failed. He calls it a contest between organized modern technology versus organized human beings and concludes the human beings won. It immediately flips the script from American power to Vietnamese resilience and the limits of military might against popular will.
And he digs into the reasons for U.S. involvement, arguing it wasn't really about democracy in South Vietnam.
No, he argues the official justifications were largely pretext. He points to internal government documents like a National Security Council memo from 1952, long before the major escalation, which reveals the core motivation: fear that communist control of Southeast Asia would jeopardize U.S. security interests in the Far East, and critically, cut off access to the region's resources, the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum.
So economics and resources, again, like in Cuba and the Philippines.
Exactly. Zinn sees a consistent pattern: intervention driven by strategic and economic interests, cloaked in ideological rhetoric about fighting communism or promoting democracy.
And Zinn doesn't shy away from detailing the brutality of the war itself.
Not at all. He provides graphic accounts of the realities on the ground: the widespread use of napalm burning civilians alive, the creation of free fire zones where anyone remaining was considered an enemy combatant, justifying indiscriminate killing, the routine search and destroy missions that often devolved into village burnings and civilian deaths.
And specific massacres, like My Lai.
Yes, the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers under Lieutenant William Calley methodically shot to death hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese villagers, mostly old men, women, children, and babies, is presented not as an isolated aberration, but as a horrifyingly logical outcome of a war strategy that dehumanized the enemy and blurred the lines between combatants and civilians. These facts starkly contrast with any notion of a just war or benevolent intervention.
But alongside this brutality, Zinn emphasizes the rise of resistance within the United States, the anti-war movement.
Yes, this is a crucial counterpoint in his narrative. He traces the remarkable growth of the anti-war movement from maybe 100 people picketing in Boston in 1965 to demonstrations of 100,000 in Washington by 1969, and then hundreds of thousands participating in marches and moratoriums across the country. He highlights the mass civil disobedience, like the May Day protests in Washington in 1971, where 14,000 people were arrested in an attempt to shut down the government.
And the role of whistleblowers. Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers.
Absolutely critical. Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo leaking the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret internal history of U.S. involvement, exposed decades of government lies and deceit to the American public. Zinn notes that despite the government charging them with espionage, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the right of the New York Times and Washington Post to publish the papers, a major victory for freedom of the press and a huge blow to government secrecy. It showed the power of truth-telling and challenging the war machine.
And the anti-war spirit even spread within the military. Zinn argues this was decisive.
Yes, he considers this perhaps the most significant factor in ending the war. He provides numerous examples: a black private in Oakland refusing to board a troop plane to Vietnam, officers resigning their commissions, a Navy nurse court-martialed for marching in an anti-war protest in uniform, and critically, widespread resistance among GIs in Vietnam. Soldiers wearing peace symbols, refusing orders to go on patrol, sometimes called search and avoid missions, yelling, "This isn't our war," even incidents of fragging, killing unpopular officers.
And veterans speaking out back home.
Powerfully so. Zinn highlights the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW, featuring voices like Ron Kovich, later known for Born on the 4th of July, paralyzed in Vietnam, who returned home and became a leading anti-war activist. Veterans throwing away their medals in protest on the Capitol steps was an incredibly potent symbol. This internal resistance, Zinn argues, made the Army unreliable and ultimately forced the U.S. withdrawal.
So the war's end brought not victory, but disillusionment.
Deep disillusionment, Zinn argues, with the government, the military, the entire rationale for the war. He quotes the veteran New York Times foreign correspondent C.L. Sulzberger writing after the fall of Saigon. "The U.S. emerges as the big loser, and history books must admit this." And Sulzberger added the crucial insight: "We lost the war in the Mississippi Valley, not the Mekong Valley." This powerful statement perfectly encapsulates Zinn's central argument. The war was ultimately lost because of the massive popular resistance at home, a testament to the power of ordinary people challenging entrenched authority.
Okay, let's look at the period after Vietnam and Watergate. Zinn sees the establishment trying to restore faith in the system.
Yes, the narrative promoted at the time was one of cleansing and renewal. Nixon resigning, Ford taking over it was framed as purging the country of its rascals and returning to a healthy state. Time to move on, the system works.
But Zinn argues this focus on individual misconduct missed the point.
Exactly. He points out that the impeachment charges against Nixon deliberately avoided the deeper, more fundamental issues, things like the secret illegal bombing of Cambodia, the FBI and CIA abuses of power, the role of corporate money in politics. These were fundamental policies continuous among American presidents, not just Nixon's personal flaws.
So getting rid of Nixon allowed the system itself to continue unchanged.
That's Zinn's argument. Focus on the individual rascal to avoid confronting the systemic problems. Corporate influence, for example, he argues, is a permanent fact of the American system that wasn't addressed by Nixon's departure.
And the establishment was worried about the Vietnam syndrome, the public's reluctance to support new military interventions.
Deeply concerned. Zinn argues they immediately look for ways to overcome it, to reassert American military power and credibility. Ford's actions after the Mayaguez incident in 1975 are a key example. After Cambodian forces seized a U.S. merchant ship, Ford ordered military action, including bombing Cambodia, even after the ship's crew had already been released. The operation resulted in 41 American military deaths to rescue 39 sailors who were already safe. Zinn calls it a display of moral blindness and military bungling, driven by a desire to show force, violating the War Powers Act passed specifically to prevent such presidential overreach.
And Reagan continued this pattern.
Yes, Reagan also largely ignored the War Powers Act in interventions in Lebanon, and, most notably, the invasion of Grenada in 1983.
Grenada seemed like a small target to reassert power. Zinn connects it to economics, too.
He does. While justified publicly as rescuing American medical students and stopping Cuban influence, Zinn notes a later Wall Street Journal article calling Grenada an invasion of banks. The tiny island had become a major center for offshore banking, 118 banks in a capital of 7,500 people. This raises that important question Zinn constantly asks. What's the connection between military intervention and promoting capitalist enterprise? He suggests the motives are often intertwined, with U.S. foreign policy driven not just by fear of communism or terrorism, but by a broader fear of revolution in various parts of the world that might threaten U.S. economic interests or political control.
And this involves supporting brutal regimes if they served U.S. interests. Zinn mentions El Salvador.
Yes, the Reagan administration's policy in Central America is a stark example. Zinn details the administration initially scoffing at reports of a horrific massacre in the village of El Mozote, El Salvador, in 1981, where hundreds of civilians, mostly women and children, were systematically killed by a U.S.-trained Salvadoran army battalion. Later forensic evidence confirmed the massacre, unearthing scores of skeletons, mostly children, in the ruins of the village church. It highlights the U.S. government's willingness to overlook, deny, or even enable horrific human rights abuses by allied regimes in the name of fighting leftist movements, a profound moral cost.
And the bombing of Libya in 1986, Zinn frames that as terrorism itself.
Yes, the U.S. bombed Tripoli and Benghazi, aiming for Muammar Gaddafi's compound. The bombing killed dozens of civilians, including Gaddafi's young adopted daughter. Zinn quotes international law professor Stephen Shalom calling the bombing one of the most serious incidents of international terrorism of the year. It flips the script, challenging the U.S. narrative of fighting terrorism by pointing out when U.S. actions themselves fit that description. Zinn consistently argues U.S. foreign policy, particularly interventions, often creates more instability and anti-American sentiment, driven by that underlying fear of independent movements or revolutions.
Domestically, during the Reagan-Bush years, Zinn points to a major shift in the judiciary.
A dramatic transformation. Reagan and Bush appointed over half of all federal judges, including several Supreme Court justices, deliberately creating a predominantly conservative judiciary. Zinn argues this had profound impacts, rolling back progress on issues like women's abortion rights, through decisions like Webster and Casey chipping away at Roe v. Wade, and affirmative action programs designed to address racial inequality. It demonstrates how presidential power can reshape the legal landscape and social policy for decades through strategic judicial appointments.
And economically, who benefited most during this era, according to Zinn?
Unequivocally, corporate America became the greatest beneficiary. Zinn details how tax bills passed under Reagan drastically lowered tax rates on the very rich. The top rate fell to 28%, and corporations, effectively gutting the progressive income tax system. The result? The net worth of the Forbes 400 richest Americans tripled during the 1980s. Zinn cites figures suggesting about $1 trillion was transferred from the lower and middle classes to the wealthiest 1% of the country between 1978 and 1990.
A massive upward redistribution of wealth.
Yes, highlighting a systemic inequality actively worsened by government policy, despite rhetoric about trickle-down economics or broad prosperity. It shows how policy choices directly widened the wealth gap and concentrated power.
But Zinn also finds evidence that public opinion wasn't necessarily aligned with these conservative policies.
Yes, this is fascinating. He points to polls showing nuanced views. While the label welfare was often unpopular, partly due to political framing and racial coding, a 1992 poll found 64% of Americans saying the government should help the poor. A 1987 poll found 62% believing the government should guarantee food and shelter for those who couldn't afford them.
So a disconnect between public sentiment favoring social support and the political direction of the country.
A clear disconnect. It suggests a deeper public desire for social safety nets and government responsibility than was acknowledged or acted upon by either major political party during that era. Zinn sees this as a quiet, often untapped current of potential dissent or alternative values.
And this disconnect was highlighted by activists.
Dramatically so. Zinn quotes Marian Wright Edelman, head of the Children's Defense Fund, starkly posing the guns versus children dilemma. She pointed out the billions spent on military hardware while programs for children's health, nutrition, and housing were being cut, highlighting the devastating human cost of prioritizing military spending over social welfare.
And signs of discontent weren't limited to polls. Zinn mentions protests.
Yes, he notes continued resistance. Farmers facing foreclosure organized protests, sometimes physically resisting eviction. Unemployed steelworkers demonstrated against Reagan's policies. Black communities in places like Miami rioted against poverty and police brutality. It showed widespread deprivation and struggle across different groups, proving discontent was still simmering beneath the surface of official narratives of prosperity and national strength.
Zinn concludes by talking about a permanent adversarial culture. What does he mean by that?
He means that despite efforts by the establishment to control narratives, suppress dissent, or co-opt movements, there remains a persistent, often unreported culture of resistance and critical thinking in America. It's made up of countless individuals and groups challenging power in various ways.
Can you give some examples he uses?
He mentions activists like Ann Braden organizing poor white and black communities in the South against environmental racism, fighting toxic waste dumps and chemical plants placed in their neighborhoods. He points to Cesar Chavez and the Chicano farm workers continuing their long struggle for rights in California through strikes and boycotts. He talks about a new generation of public interest lawyers defending the poor, representing whistleblowers challenging corporate or government wrongdoing. These are the often unseen grassroots battles that Zinn argues constitute this ongoing adversarial culture.
And movements like the women's movement continued despite backlash.
Absolutely. Zinn emphasizes that despite a powerful conservative backlash aiming to roll back gains, the women's movement remained a strong force. He points to massive rallies defending abortion rights, like the 300,000-strong march in Washington in 1989, as evidence of its continued vitality. He also highlights rank-and-file workers rebelling against corrupt or complacent union leadership, like the reform movement within the Teamsters Union that eventually voted out a notoriously corrupt old guard. And groups like Food Not Bombs, sharing free food with the homeless in defiance of city ordinances, illustrating local, direct action and grassroots defiance.
These are all examples of people organizing outside conventional politics.
Yes, constantly pushing back, challenging the established order, keeping alternative ideas and forms of resistance alive, even when they don't make headlines.
What about the first Gulf War in 1991? How does Zinn interpret that and the reaction to it?
Zinn suggests many in the establishment saw the Gulf War as an opportunity to finally overcome the Vietnam Syndrome, to demonstrate decisive U.S. military power and restore public confidence in intervention. While initial polls showed high support for the war, Zinn cautions against taking that at face value, suggesting it reflected an atmosphere charged with patriotic fervor, heavily influenced by government propaganda and media coverage that largely excluded dissenting voices.
But there was dissent.
Significant dissent, though often marginalized. Zinn notes prominent black leaders questioning why resources were going to war abroad instead of addressing poverty and injustice at home. Vietnam veterans spoke out against the war. There were protests across the country, including acts of self-immolation by veterans horrified by the prospect of another war. It demonstrated intense anti-war sentiment existed, even if it wasn't the dominant narrative.
And the Columbus Quincentennial in 1992 became another site of protest.
Yes, a major focal point for challenging the traditional celebratory narrative of American history. Zinn highlights the National Council of Churches, calling the anniversary an occasion for oppression, degradation, and genocide for Native peoples. He mentions Michelle Diamond, arrested for protesting a Columbus exhibit, saying, "It's a human issue, not just a red Indian issue," connecting the historical injustice to ongoing concerns. It showed how re-examining and challenging foundational myths became a powerful act of resistance and a demand for historical truth.
So Zinn strongly critiques those who see American history as purely progressive.
He fundamentally rejects that view, exemplified by thinkers like Alan Bloom, who presented American history as this unbroken, ineluctable progress of freedom and equality. Zinn argues such narratives are deeply flawed because they ignore or minimize the brutal realities of class conflict, racism, sexism, and imperialism that he has painstakingly documented. This kind of patriotic education, Zinn argues, prevents us from understanding how the American system actually works and for whom.
And he reflects on the nature of history writing itself, the choices involved.
Yes, it's one of his most profound reflections near the end. He states clearly, "There are no pure facts in history. Behind every selection of facts presented is a judgment about what is important, what is worth telling, and what can be omitted. The historian always takes a side, consciously or not. He forces us, the reader, you, the listener, to constantly ask, in whose interest is this story being told? In whose interest are wars waged?" He urges us to try, at least mentally, to wipe out the national boundaries of the world and thought of all children everywhere as our own. Because if we did that, he argues, war would become impossible, as wars are always, ultimately, wars against children.
And he acknowledges his own blind spots changed over time.
Yes, he candidly admits that earlier editions of his book had shortcomings, like neglecting the specific struggles of Latino communities or gay and lesbian individuals. He updated later editions to include these histories, highlighting that uncovering and acknowledging these missing stories is a continuous, evolving process of critical examination, even for himself.
How does he conclude? Does he see hope for change?
He concludes with a complex mix of critique and hope. He calls the American system perhaps the most ingenious system of control in world history because it's flexible. It manages dissent by distributing just enough wealth to just enough people, particularly the middle classes, the potential guards of the system, to limit discontent and prevent unified revolt.
But he still sees potential for change.
Yes. Despite this sophisticated system of control, he points to the bubbling of change under the surface of obedience. He sees it internationally, Russian women protesting war, movements against female genital mutilation. He sees it domestically, the militancy of welfare mothers fighting for dignity, the growing distrust of government, business, and the military, even among those middle-class guards. This widespread disillusionment, he suggests, holds potential for future mobilization, for what he calls the coming revolt of the guards.
So history offers lessons in resistance.
That's his final message. History, particularly the people's history, he tells, reminds us of the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist, of apparently contented people to demand change. It reveals a powerful human impulse to assert one's humanity. And this impulse, he concludes, always offers the possibility of surprise. Change is always possible, often when least expected.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what does Zinn's people's history ultimately mean for us, the listener, today? It's more than just a different set of facts, isn't it?
Oh, much more. Zinn doesn't just present a different version of the past. He really gives us tools, a different framework for critically examining our present. His work isn't about, simply wallowing in past injustices, though acknowledging them is crucial. It's about recognizing the patterns of power, exploitation, and crucially resistance that have shaped the U.S. and arguably still shape our world today.
So it challenges us to look at current events differently.
Exactly. It challenges us to constantly ask whose voices are missing from the stories we're being told now? Who benefits from the dominant narrative about progress or national interest today? How does ignoring certain perspectives shape our understanding and our actions?
That connects back to his point about ideological choices in history writing.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, one of Zinn's powerful underlying messages resonates. The cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. His powerful call to listen to the marginalized, to those excluded from the traditional histories, is really a continuous invitation for all of us to reevaluate what we think we know, to question assumptions, and to consider the ongoing struggles happening right now for a more just and humane society.
So a final thought for you, our listener, building on that. What other stories, what other perspectives might be waiting to be uncovered in the history you think you know? Could be your local history, your family history, national history.
And perhaps more importantly, how might listening to those hidden or marginalized stories empower us not just to understand the past differently, but to act more consciously, more justly in the present? That's the challenge Zinn leaves us with.